how do we make sure we accommodate the national interest of our food, fuel, and fiber production, which gives our country energy independence and food security, which is not just economic value, but national security value?
That is a fantastic question, and it goes to the heart of, we're talking today about how do you fund the federal government's role. We haven't talked a whole lot about is what should the federal government's role be.
Yes.
So we've built the interstate, phenomenal project, that's great. The federal government obviously has a huge role when it comes to safety, huge role when it comes to standardization of signage, like the MUTCD, huge role in terms of connecting rural America. So, I mean, the question would be, listen, 1956, rural America was left out because there's no highway there. Good news, there's a highway there, but there's no broadband, right? So you don't have an information highway is kind of now bypassing these towns. So I think this is a great opportunity for Congress to step back and say, what is that role the federal government should play? Clearly, it's an important role. Federal government is a major player in infrastructure and our nation's economy. And how do we structure that for the 21st century?
So let me follow up with some more fundamental questions for a new guy on the committee. How does one, or should one, define a federally appropriate, nationally significant project? That is, I'm certain over time, just in my short time in Congress, that there's been all kinds of creep with respect to what is a federally appropriate, nationally significant. That is, what's most appropriate to spend the taxpayer monies on to connect all of us in terms of people and product moving safely and efficiently around the country?
Another great question. With all respect to the chairman, in the past it's been a project in the chairman's district was the one that was federally appropriate and really needed a lot of attention. Not to this committee, but just generally. And so that is the key question. I mean, when I was working in the White House, met with elected officials from all over the country, and every single elected official had a nationally important project in their area. Every single one. Yeah. So it becomes really hard, but I do think it's important for us, for taxpayers, to just sort of clarify for them that is what we're spending money on, and it's not being spent elsewhere.
I've got some.
I'd like to go back to the disagreement between me and the commissioner, if we can, for a second, because friendly disagreement, because I think what the commissioner is missing, and I welcome her to contradict me on this, is that what New Jersey is saying is that New Jersey would like federal tax dollars from other states other than New Jersey to come to New Jersey to help subsidize New Jersey infrastructure. If you look at the mass transit document that was mentioned earlier, New Jersey gets $4 back for every dollar of investment. Alabama gets 56 cents back. New Jersey's 9th wealthiest, Alabama's 43rd. So there's this disparity that doesn't make any sense. So when you're talking about additional federal revenue, what you mean is more revenue than you gave in as a state, which means other states are now contributing to your state. And I think it's important when we talk about additional federal revenue that we look at it in that context, as opposed to kind of this urban myth that federal revenue comes from this source that is neither state nor local taxpayers. Like, every federal dollar comes from a local taxpayer.
And when user fee coming down the pipeline. And I appreciate my friend from Oregon. He's been out on the vehicle miles traveled, looking at electric cars and things of that nature. That, to me, is looking over the horizon for a sustainable user fee model here. What do you see? I mean, as we go to autonomous vehicles, as we go to next generation transportation, is there anything in the spectrum space that could be tolled, if you would? Is there anything from the power generation sources that are out there? Some folks have talked about converting America's resources in our oil and natural gas, now that we're the world's largest exporter of natural gas and oil, using that as a potential resource to convert and invest in America's infrastructure. Mr. Gribbin, or anyone, maybe we'll start with Mr. Gribbin, are those some pots of revenue we should potentially look at creatively?
No, there absolutely is. There's a virtually infinite source of potential revenues. I think what you want to do is make a revenue source that's tied closely to the benefit that's being received from the user. You know, your constituent, when they're paying that fee, are they paying that fee and they're seeing that being reinvested back into their commute or not? So, you know, Oregon's taking the lead on vehicle miles traveled. That's a fantastic method, not only because it can raise revenue, but it also can be used for congestion pricing, so you can mitigate congestion at the same time. I would disagree with Mr. Lee on one thing in terms of the federal government funding as necessary. My home state of Virginia, we're building a multi-billion-dollar project. Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel has no federal funding, and we've suffered no delays in any way in delivering on that project.
Yes. So, Mr. Gribbin, would there be any impact in the overall cost of transportation infrastructure investment if significantly more private sector funds were available to the local, state, and federal governments for that purpose? And would such resources, those private funds, drive the cost of infrastructure improvements downward in instances where private capital competes for opportunities to partner with our public entities on infrastructure projects?
Congressman, that's an excellent question. First, I'd like to make sure that we're discerning clearly between funding and financing.
Financing.
Private investments coming in, like a loan or any other form that has to be paid back over time.
Sure.
Typically, what would happen if, and I used to work for Macquarie Capital, advise state and local governments on attracting private equity to these types of investments, you would do what's called a value for money study, because the cost of your capital is going to be higher, but at the same time, your design costs, your construction costs, and your operation and maintenance costs will all be lower. And if that net's positive for the government, then you should do a public-private partnership. If it doesn't, you shouldn't. So there are really good tools out there today. The one thing I mentioned a little bit before, but I want to highlight again, private activity bonds. In 2005, a $15 billion allotment was made. We are right on the edge of that entire allotment being consumed. Private activity bonds and TIFIA are absolutely critical in ensuring that private capital can compete against governmental capital. So you have debt, in essence, in TIFIA and private activity bonds, you're able to get debt for your project that's roughly equivalent to what the government would be able to get in a tax-exempt situation.
Good. Well,
Indiana and Iowa and Michigan that have stepped up, Ohio, to raise the gas tax. And so, they obviously have looked at it and figured out the way to do it. In Illinois, we put a measure on the ballot a couple years ago that said, if you knew the money was going into a lockbox and only spent on roads and bridges and infrastructure, would you support it? Well, overwhelmingly they did. And so when we look at how do we assure the public, because many of my constituents are very dubious of the federal government taking more of their money, going into a big black hole and never being spent on infrastructure. And I think we have, again, a responsibility to assure the public on how to do that in a responsible way. And I think that will give us more, give us a better ability to get something done on infrastructure. Mr. Gribbin, I was going to ask you if you have any comments on that, on how we should address that.
Yeah, no, I think that's, thank you, Congressman, and appreciate your family's commitment to infrastructure. That is an excellent question. And one of the reasons why the administration supported funding an incentive program to help state and local governments that were increasing revenue streams for infrastructure is exactly the dynamic you talked about. I think the public is very skeptical of sending dollars very far away to have them come back. Virginia has created 2 different tax districts, one here in Northern Virginia, one in Hampton Roads area. Very, very successful, generating a lot of revenue. So I think when you think about infrastructure, yes, the Highway Trust Fund is important, but it's actually a relatively small component of infrastructure as a whole. If we think more about total investment in infrastructure, what can the federal government do to incentivize that pie to grow? It's really more about stimulating and overcoming political opposition at the state and local level than it is about generating new federal revenue.
Gotcha.